Now, when we finished up on Monday, we were covering the era, the age of the church between AD 100 and about AD 313, which could well have been called the church persecuted. But there's other terms that would also describe at least some part of what was going on then. Now we find the exact opposite starting to take place, because with the Edict of Milan in about 311, Constantine consolidating his power as emperor over the whole Roman Empire once again. Remember, it had been divided in the days of Diocletian about 25-30 years before into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire with two emperors. And when Constantine rose to being emperor of the western part of the empire, then eventually he has a battle with the Eastern emperor and wins that. And then he reconsolidates the empire, but then moves his capital to the Eastern Empire's capital, which was appropriately renamed after him, Constantinople, because his name was Constantine. And so this becomes now, this period of time from about 300 or 313 up to the next major shift in the church, which is with Pope Gregory in 590. Thank you, sir. This will be what we might well call the church dominant. Then that next period of time after that, starting with Pope Gregory, we might well call it the church supreme. It's dominant because it actually wields more influence than the empire it does during this period of time, simply because the government has not only made it legal, but more than that, all but one of the men sitting on the throne of the empire are to one degree or another committed to the Christian faith. And so it's granted not just legal status, it's granted favored status in the empire. And so that's why it's the church dominant. It ends up influencing the policy of the government. It receives benefits from the government that other religions do not, such as money to build church buildings, money to have copies of the Bible made and distributed, and things like that. It even gets the blessing of the government and support of the government when at times they actually persecute those who are not Christian. How quickly things turn around. But there's something else that's also going on during this period of time, and that is, this is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The western half, which is classically considered the Roman Empire, will fall during this period of time. Rome, because the government has moved out and has moved to Constantinople, while Rome is still a noble city and a large city, is no longer enjoying the special blessings, privileges, and protection that having the government located there would afford them. And they become subject during the 400s to a number of invasions by barbarians and others who will loot and sack and even burn parts of the city. And finally, in effect, the western part of the empire will pretty much disintegrate in terms of one unified political entity. And this will be, over the long term, the beginning of the rise of states. Gaul will eventually, and Britannia will eventually become their own separate countries, their own governments, because there's no empire anymore to weld them all together and hold them together. And so that's how gradually the church will go from being the church dominant to the church supreme, when it just completely all falls apart in the West. But again, that's more our Western slanted view of church history. That wouldn't at all be the case if we were looking at it entirely from the eastern part of the church. And so the decline of the Roman Empire is one big thing to know. If you go online and haven't already, get the notes. I've already put them up for today's class. You'll see that's the first thing I give you a timeline of, is the decline of the Roman Empire. You might also notice that the notes for today are only 2 pages long. The notes for Monday were 6 pages long. Didn't I tell you that my favorite part of church history was the first 300 years? So there you go. That's why you got 6 pages on Monday and only 2 pages today. It's not that I don't like this part and don't know this part. It's just I don't find it quite as fascinating as the early part. So what happens when you have a church empowered by the government? Well, we see the not only the church, we might even say interfering with the business of the nation, but you see the head of the government interfering with the business of the church. No longer is it persecuting the church, but the government feels like they have a vested interest in what the church does because Constantine saw the church as a unifying influence in his empire. And most of the emperors that followed him followed that policy, and therefore he would do things and demand that the church do things that would bring about unity, sometimes at the expense of doctrinal correctness. So that's why Constantine will call for the first universal council. Leaders of the church coming from all around the Roman Empire, all to one place to settle this issue about the Arian controversy, as it's called. This doctrine being taught, not just by Arius, but he was sort of the head of it, but many others that had been convinced by his teaching and so forth. So Constantine wants that dealt with, and I don't think he really cared what the final outcome of that meeting was, just as long as everybody agreed that this was going to be what the church everywhere was going to hold to. And he pretty much got his wish in that regard, although it's commonly known, or believed at least, that when he was near death, and by that time many people delayed baptism until just before death because they had sort of the idea that while all your sins are forgiven at baptism, there's nothing left to forgive them with if you sin after your baptism. They didn't have the view we do today that if we walk in the light, He's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins even after our baptism. And so he waited to just before his death, and he was baptized by an Arian priest. A man, one who taught the Arian doctrine instead of the more orthodox doctrine that had been adopted by the Council of Nicaea itself. But in the church itself, with the church empowered by the government, there will be the beginning of these church councils, and over the next 450 years there'll be 7 of them, 7 major ones, and there'd never been one before. And now they'll suddenly have 7 of them over the next 450 years to try to deal with what should have been at least major concerns for the whole church. And so that was a big shift in the way the church was working. And of course, it's the metropolitan bishops who lead the way in this, the 5 major cities we talked about last time, but then supported by the smaller bishops beneath them and with the backing of the emperor, whoever he might have been. There's going to be some major doctrinal issues come up and controversies during this time. One that's left over from on Monday, it just was beginning just as our time was ending. That is, time in history was ending, and that is the Donatist controversy. First we had the Novatian controversy at near the end of the 200s, what to do with those Traitadores, those who, when the persecution broke out because of Diocletian and then was carried on by Galerius, what do you do with those people who recant their faith and make the sacrifice to the genius of the emperor or to the gods, and then get their little labellus, little piece of paper that says they've done that, or even those that went further and because of the persecution actually turn over Christian documents, the scriptures, to be destroyed. And more especially this was focused on everybody that did that, but more especially some of the church leaders, bishops, elders, deacons who did that. And so Novatian said they cannot be accepted back into the church, especially the bishops. And Whereas we had Cyprian down in Carthage who was saying, no, if they repent and show the fruits of repentance by fasting and prayer and a time of sort of a trial testing, then they can be brought back into the church and maybe even become leaders again. Yes, sir?
Wouldn't you say that the council in Jerusalem and Act Accord in Acts 15 gives us an example and authority to have these type of meetings?
That would, I never actually saw anyone argue that in that period of time, but I suppose that could be a view of that. And I'm not even disagreeing necessarily with it happening. I'm just saying it just hadn't happened before.
Yeah.
And the meeting in Jerusalem did have some significant differences. It seemed to be dominated by the apostles, with only the elders from Jerusalem participating. We don't find any leaders other than the apostles, as far as we know, really participating in it beyond those that were from Jerusalem. So it wasn't there weren't representatives from Ephesus, Corinth, and so forth there that we know of. So there are some differences, but still, you might well argue that that was a precedent.
Well, yeah, didn't they send representatives from Antioch, though? Isn't that kind of point with Paul and Barnabas?
They did send Paul and Barnabas down for that, and that's a good point in favor of that view. Yeah, we're just falling into an area where we don't have direct statement, pro or con, in the Scriptures about such a thing, and so the church chose to do it one way. We may feel uncomfortable with that or even disagree with it, but at that time they didn't see that as an issue. And of course, they've already quite a ways down the road of a change in the whole organizational structure of the church by now anyway. Yes, sir?
On the Donatism?
Yes.
When you showed that trailer for Silence, that was, I think, kind of the premise. There was a leader that went over, and he, in his torture and everything, kind of denied his faith. And then, the higher-ups were kind of like, well, he's not a part of us anymore.
Yeah.
So is that a part of the Catholic Church today?
I think there's a certain amount of that still. I can't speak with very much authority about what all their practices or doctrines about that is today. But
That's a question.
Obviously, they're struggling with it as well because they're trying to deal with these abusers and others in the church who weren't kicked out or dealt with when they should have. And now what do you do? And so it's a big issue, not just for them, but for the church, using church in the broadest sense, church everywhere. How do you deal with fallen leaders or leaders that...
It's a difficult thing for us. I mean, we're
Yes.
not in that kind of persecution, but if we had if Monty downstairs was tortured and confessed publicly on national television, that Jesus was not the Christ,
Yeah.
I'd have some sympathy with this torture, but then, where does that leave, church leadership and things?
That's right, yeah. And I think that's a very important thing you're actually bringing up, is realize these people were trying to deal with very real issues that many times are not so very different than what we still try to deal with today. And they were doing it without maybe any direct guidance from those writings they considered Holy Scripture. And so they're trying to, based on basic principles from the Scriptures, make decisions and do things that are for the benefit of the church and they believe would please God and glorify Him and so forth in the process. But yes?
Just out of curiosity, when these church councils came together, did these churches, by this time, did they have any name, or did they just go by the church? Like as a whole, like when there was overseers and bishops and all that, were they just considered all the church, or was there different?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it. When you read the historians, and mostly when we're reading the historians, we're reading secondary sources, not the original writings, but we do have access to a great deal of the writings of the church fathers from this period of time in 300 to 600. They will refer to numerous churches or congregations, for example, in Rome. But they, at the same time, would turn around and just refer to the church in Rome. It's almost like, even though there were many congregations, it was still just considered one church.
Yeah.
In the same way with Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and so forth. And I don't know if in Rome, they said, this is the Sixth and Jackson Church of Christ in Rome or something like that. I don't know how they designated, but they very much had the idea that the church is one. And we don't have that benefit today, do we? I mean, when I say church, I'm talking about Christianity in its broader sense. Any town of any size, any community almost of any size you go into, there's going to be churches very different from each other in practice, doctrine, name, and so forth. And that was not so much the case with them. And it did create some difficulties for them with things like when Arius came along, or even earlier with Marcion. They will start establishing their own congregations. And they will be in competition to the congregations that were already in that area. And the church struggled to know, what do we do about them? Are we one with them, or do we just excommunicate the whole bunch of them? And they didn't, for a long time, they didn't have a clear picture of what to do about that. Gradually, the practice developed that they're excommunicated. In fact, that's where the Donatist controversy comes in the early 300s. It's just sort of a follow-up to the one with the Novatian, but it goes the next step. And the Donatists, there was a bishop named Donatus who was advocating. He was the successor to Cyprian, who was so moderate in this subject and said, yes, if they repent and so forth, they can be brought back in. Donatus, his successor, says, if they're not with the bishop, they're not in the church. And so if they do not follow the lead of their bishop and the church they're in, then they are out, individuals or whole groups. And that became the Donatist controversy, because the church everywhere didn't necessarily want to practice it just that way. It wasn't yet agreed to that. And yet over time that does become the dominant doctrine of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Is that unless you are submissive to the bishop in the area you're in and a part of the church that he heads in that area, then you're not in the church at all. And therefore you're cut off from the sacraments, receiving the grace as they considered it to be from the Lord, and communion and baptism and marriage ceremonies and all sorts of things that they practiced. And all of those were ways of receiving the Lord's grace and their way of thinking of it. But that all is administered by the bishop, or now more and more they're being called priests unless you're high up in the hierarchy. And so you don't get that. But the church is empowered. At the same time, a movement that had begun back during the days of church persecuted, where some individuals wanted to be so close to God, they would actually withdraw from the social life of the church and of their communities, and would go out into the desert or up into the mountains and create these sort of, in some cases they just lived alone, in others they would create sort of communes where they would live in extreme poverty, extreme ascetic practices of fasting and prayer and Bible reading, or whatever it might be. And that early movement that happened then goes ahead and gets more formalized in the church during this period of time. And so we start having those who are labeled monks, and those women who participate in this lifestyle as what now we would call nuns. And they actually started creating, not movements, that's not the right word, orders. There's the word I'm looking for. They created these orders, these groups of people who were all bound together by a common commitment. And they were separated from each other, men, because being ascetic, they were already practicing celibacy. That wasn't yet the policy of the church, but that's what they had adopted for themselves, and that will eventually come back into the church. So the church will start enforcing celibacy pretty much by the end of this period of time we're in. That will become the norm for the church, that bishops at first they just said it would be better if the bishop and the priest was celibate. By Pope Gregory's time, it was mandatory. But it didn't just all happen one day when somebody issued the orders. It was a thing that at first they just thought was for those who were extremists, and then for those who were totally committed, and then for everybody who was going to be in the ministry. Now the Eastern Church, they didn't go that far. That's in the Eastern Church, even today, many of their priests and bishops are married.
And that's what I was going to ask you. Kind of what you're describing was more the Western.
Yes, we're turning our attention more and more towards the West, and by West we mean, from Greece, Rome, Europe, and when we get to that point a few sessions from now, the United States, and we're starting to neglect a lot more what's happening in the East.
And let me ask you this. At this point in time where we're between 300 AD and 590, right?
Yes.
So at this
313 and 590.
At this point, the Western Church has Catholicism and the whole Vatican Catholic movement came into being, or is that a little bit after, or is...
No, Rome was, the whole Western Church was under the influence just of Rome already by this time. The Eastern Church was still divided between those four other major cities. Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. They all were exerting influence in the East, but Rome was a major influencer in the Western Church and the Western Empire then when it first rose and then started falling.
So their structure, whatever the religious structure of Rome began to bleed into
Yeah,
the church.
they pretty much were dictating the structure everywhere by their own structure. And the bishop there gradually is gaining more and more influence, and it was not an influence of military influence. It's just more and more all the churches are told generation after generation to look to Rome for your leadership, and so they do more and more and more until finally it becomes totally dominant. And then with Gregory, he at last can claim at least to be the bishop of the whole church everywhere, even though the East very much disagreed with him. Yes, you were first, I think.
I've spoken just with a friend who's Catholic about some of this stuff, and a lot of stuff he said was he realizes a priest in the Vatican and all that understand the Bible way better than him, so they understand and translate it for them. So like they don't view general Catholics don't view knowing the Bible personally as very important because it's being handed down to them. Was that already the concept when these bishops were coming into power?
That was being developed during this time. Because, of course, the bishops not only were in those positions of authority, but they were the ones who had access.
To the scriptures, right?
Yeah, even at this date, of course, up until Constantine, a church would struggle to maybe have one copy of one letter of the Apostle Paul for their very own. And so much of the teaching was oral, and it came from the bishops down to them. And so he was always considered the person who knew the Bible, knew the most of the Bible, and knew it best and what it taught. And of course, he was getting it by then from higher up, from the metropolitan bishop, who was getting it from the patriarch. There was this sort of a flow down or trickle down effect. And that's still very much in the Catholic Church way of thinking even today. Yes, sir.
But it was it wasn't so much that, it seems to be more organic
Yes.
of a development in that sense than Rome just being really assertive and intentional about lording their power, though it may have got to that point.
That's actually a beautiful word to describe it, and that's what I would like for us to understand, whether we agree with it or not, and I don't agree with it, with what ended up happening. But it just explains what it's a very natural, organic kind of thing that was developing here. Now, it could have gone other ways, but this is just the way it did go and the way it developed. And here we are 1,500 years later, and we're still seeing that very much in the church, because at a certain point, the organic became institutionalized. It stopped being organic and it became institutional. That is, this is in the very structure of the bylaws and rules and regulations of the church.
First, maybe it became,
Yeah, part of that was his work, yeah. He was a great administrator, and that's one of the things he administered. So the church is empowered. We have some great theologians arise, Augustine being considered foremost about them, though he wasn't necessarily considered the greatest in his time, but in later times he was. The church looked back on him through the Middle Ages as a great thinker. He wrote this book called the City of God, I think it was called. It was just tremendously influential, considering there wasn't even printing presses yet to make many, many copies of it, in which he talked about the church as God's city setting in the midst of the cities of men. And that was very influential in the thinking of the church and the leaders of the church for a long time. And yet at the same time, when the Reformation began with Martin Luther and John Calvin, particularly John Calvin, Calvin was a student of Augustine's writings, and much of his proposals about Calvinism was drawn from Augustine. Which is pretty interesting, since the church for 1,000 years had been saying they were standing on the shoulders of Augustine with its policies and doctrines, and then when the Reformation comes along, the Reformation is built on the shoulders of Augustine. But there were some other men also very influential as theologians. Three in particular that often get mentioned were three men called the Cappadocians, because they were from Cappadocia, or Cappadocia, that again in Asia Minor. One of the regions of Asia Minor is Cappadocia. And these three men, let's see, I have them listed here, are Basil of Cappadocia, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, along with the sister, I think, of one of them, who herself was considered a great Bible scholar in her day. And they were champions of the church during that period of time in defending the orthodox view adopted at the Council of Nicaea about the divinity of Christ, the Trinity, and various other doctrines and practices of the church. Even though they were from, by our way of thinking today, a place that we hadn't even heard of before.
Hey, brother,
Yes, sir.
What bullet point are we up under right now?
Well, I just jumped ahead to pull the names of those men out, but if you happen to have the notes that had already been put up, the second major heading, the church empowered by government, right at the very end of that, there is, as we've already said, this increasing dominance of the see or the seat in Rome in the Western Church. I do provide a timeline of some things happening during this period of time in those notes as well.
Dominant Church, AD,
Right, yes.
313.
And we already know some of those, the Edict of Milan in 313. Then there was the beginning of this Arian heresy in AD 320, is about when Arius a bishop started rising up teaching this. And what he was teaching was that Christ wasn't eternal. That he was divine in the sense that he was the greatest creation of God, and he was of, we might say, a similar substance. And that word substance in English, and it's a different word in the Greek, I can't even say it, humeosos, something like that word, becomes a key word that gets debated for the next 100 years in the church. Yeah, what does that word mean, and which is a correct way of thinking about Christ. And so Arius was teaching that Jesus was not God in the sense that he was identical with the Father in his divinity. He was the first and greatest creation of God. And then once God had created him, then through him and with him they created everything else. So no matter which way you cut it, it comes down to Jesus being a created being. And that's what the church struggled with believing to be true, and yet they didn't know exactly what to believe, because up until now there hadn't been a lot of in-depth talking about and trying to define exactly how Christ was both God and man, how the incarnation actually worked. There was that event, those series of events back in the days of Marcion, back around AD 144, where he was talking about that, but he really wasn't even addressing Jesus there either. He was more talking about which God created this world and which God is the God of the Old Testament, which God is the God of the writings of Paul and the Father of Jesus, but he wasn't focusing on that. The Gnostics probably were the nearest ones actually to addressing this when they were saying that since flesh is evil and spirit is good, then Jesus, when he came, wasn't truly flesh. He just only appeared to be. And some were connecting that old Gnosticism with the teachings of Arius, which he would have strongly denied. He was just saying he was trying to understand based on the written revelation we have in the writings of the New Testament, which by that time almost all churches everywhere were agreed upon 27, same as we have today. Some were using a couple of more in addition to them. A few were still using only 23 or 25, but even the 23 that everybody everywhere could agree upon, they were all going back to those scriptures now and saying exactly what is it telling us about the nature of Christ. And how do we understand that? And you know, truthfully, we probably still, each one of us still struggle with feeling like we fully understand that even today. It's just, I just have to agree, it's a mystery. One of the last sermon series I preached down in Odessa before I stepped down from my position there back in February was a long series. I forget how many, 30-something lessons, maybe more. I call it Great is the Mystery of Godliness. Those are the words of Paul when he was writing to Timothy. And he was talking about the nature of Christ when he said that. And so I had this long series of lessons about that, trying to say what we can say from the Scriptures and what we can't say in the sense that it would be going further than what the Scriptures seem to be saying on that subject. But anyway, this Arian controversy starts up, and now because the church isn't having to worry about persecution and so forth, they give a lot more attention to it than it probably would have gotten 50 years earlier should it have come up. And so bishops everywhere start rallying to try to deal with it in their congregations and in their area, and then eventually what to do about Arius himself, because neither side in this controversy was willing to back down and say, let's just agree to disagree. Both sides felt like this was such a essential, fundamental doctrine that it needed to be resolved. And so that eventually led to the council at Nicaea. Nicaea was a small town, believe it or not, just south of Constantinople. So it wasn't easy to everyone to get there. Small rural churches probably couldn't send their bishops at all, couldn't afford to. But the large churches did, and I think altogether they had, I've read somewhere over 1,100 people in attendance, but only about 300 or so, maybe 305, were actually bishops. The others were elders, deacons, others who were there to support their bishop or serve in one way or another. And in all of this, essentially the Roman government under Constantine is underwriting or footing the bill for all this, because he wants it resolved so the church can be unified and move forward. And so they have this meeting. We'll say for another time more information about the Council of Nicaea. But then as we move on from there, that precedent is set and a document is issued called later called the Nicene Creed. A creed simply meaning this we believe, and it came from Nicaea. But interestingly enough, the Nicene Creed as we know it today is not the one they issued. It is a earlier, shorter form of the one that then was worked on again in AD 381 at the Council of Constantinople. And the one that is commonly used in churches and you commonly see in textbooks, online and so forth, is the one that came out in AD 381. They added a few things, they changed a few words because in the church in the East and the church in the West, while they were close to each other and neither side was close to what Arius was believing, they did have some minor differences with each other. in their understanding even of the nature of Christ. So it was modified in 83, 81, so both sides were comfortable with that. Yes, sir.
But it was just a small amendment, right? It's basically the same.
Yeah, they added, actually in 381, they added more information about the Holy Spirit. He only gets mentioned, I think, just one time in the original creed, but more information is added about Him. And a little more description is added about what they meant by Christ being one nature with God in 381 as compared to what was in the original.
Is that what I'm seeing here on 39 in the book?
Yeah, if we look at that right quick, let me get back to it. I read it last night again, but yeah, this is the original one here.
It seems pretty comprehensive.
Now you can actually go, and one of my good friends on the internet is Wikipedia, and realize that everything you read there may not be true. If I see an article there, I'll look for lots of footnotes, and I also look to see if at the top of it, the company that administers Wikipedia, whether it says needs more documentation, or this article has serious issues. If I see that, then don't lean on that as being reliable yet. But the ones that are well backed up, you can actually go to the Nicene Creed on Wikipedia, and they'll have the central core part of it in two columns, the 325 version and the 381 version side by side, and highlight what the differences are for you. And so that would be perhaps useful if you wanted to see that. But all sorts of other things are going on in the church. Obviously, these are doctrinal things and organizational things. All these councils will start taking place. But just in the churches themselves, changes are taking place as a result of what came to be labeled as the heresy of the Arians in the church, even though it was very influential in many places, and alternate congregations sprang up that was made up just of Arians. A very interesting thing happened during this period of time. The Arians started writing their own liturgy. And by liturgy we mean the fundamentals of how they worshiped, particularly hymns, along with sermons and so forth that really promoted their view of Christ. Whereas those with the Orthodox view started doing the same thing. And so this was actually a flowering of a period of time of new hymns for the church. But they were warring groups of hymns. And while most of them have been lost to us now, we do at least know that happened. And it finally reached a point, the date escapes me without having to go dig it out of a history of the liturgy of the church, but somewhere in the 400s, as I recall, finally the Roman bishop declares that the congregations of the churches were no longer allowed to sing, that only those designated by the bishop of the church can sing. That's how they guaranteed that only the hymns that they agreed with were sung. Because what was happening, there might be both Arians and Orthodox in the same congregation, and an Arian might just strike up a hymn right in the middle of church services and start singing, and they were well known enough, the hymns were, that everybody in the congregation suddenly was singing except the old bishop up there, and he's with his arms, stop, 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 heresy, heresy, and they're not paying any attention to him. And the Arians were actually using their hymns, they were using music to promote doctrine, teach doctrine. And even at that early date, they certainly recognized the power of music to influence the way people thought. So the church's response to it, when they couldn't deal with it any other way, is they just declared that there would be no more congregational singing in the churches.
Cooper, gotta get you a new job.
And
I've been one of them.
And that practice stood in the Western church for 1,100 years. It was not to the 1550s that the church lifted the ban on congregation singing in the Catholic Church. So that's how something that organic becomes institutional. There was a good reason, perhaps, for them temporarily, we would say, doing that, but it got locked into place and took him 1,100 years to remove it. So,
Hey, brother.
Sean was first over here.
Where's that in the notes, Richard? I'm trying to follow.
It's
along.
not.
Okay, so what year did you say that was?
I didn't,
Okay.
because I couldn't remember exactly the date.
Sometimes when I'm typing,
Yes, I understand.
blank.
Yeah, and sometimes when I'm talking, I suddenly think of something I didn't think to put in the notes at the time, and so didn't document it for you.
And the third point of that questioning is, so whatever year that was, they decided to ban singing because it was manipulating.
Yeah, I'm remembering that being about the middle of the 400s, right around 450, something like that.
Okay, so since that ban, there was manipulation of, it said singing, or is it music in general?
Just what was being sung in the churches.
Sung.
Yeah,
Is there any evidence of instruments being used up until that point?
no.
Is there any evidence of instruments not being used?
Only in the sense of they just talk about them singing. They don't talk about ever there being musicians or anything in the sense of instruments being used through most of this period of time.
So with your knowledge, would you surmise that if that was in fact something that was employed, they would have mentioned?
I would think so. They didn't seem to hesitate to mention everything else that they were doing. So, no, I'm being serious. That based on the fact that they seem to be very open about what they were doing in the churches, because by this time they're not being threatened by the government. They can be free. Suddenly we have this great flowering of books and writings and documentation that has survived down to our time, even of what they were doing back then. And but at least in general, the churches were still a cappella during this period of time, but they moved from congregational to basically a choral or a choir type
Okay.
form of singing because of that. And all the songs that were sung were approved by the bishop beforehand. So, okay, Michael.
So I'm still having just a little disconnect.
Uh-huh.
The Catholic, the Vatican, the Pope. You remember you were speaking last class and you said that the same word for father.
Yeah, Papa.
spoke,
Yeah.
right? Now, who was that first guy? Or who was those first bishops that happened?
Well, I'm sure, and I didn't make note of it, but we can go back and find the earliest reference we have, but I can't remember who it is right now, who was the first one to actually refer to the bishop as being either like a father or he is the father of the church here. But they were using it more, again, in this symbolic sense or whatever. They weren't trying to give him a title yet. But over a period of time, it started catching on, and pretty soon everywhere they were calling their bishop's father. And then when you get up to the Great Father, at the head of all of this, which in the West was the Bishop of Rome, then because Rome, the language of Italy was Latin, not Greek, and so the Greek, the Latin familial, as it's called, the family name for a father, which would say daddy or papa or pop, whatever, then they started calling him that.
So when did the church, who, again, you got the eastern part, Christians operating, but then the western part begins to develop. Now, what is the separation of the Vatican, Catholicism, that whole Vatican Pope type system?
Yeah,
What's the
well,
separation?
a real step forward in all that happening was with Gregory in AD 590 when he became, it's still, in AD 590, it didn't look like it looks like today. It's still going to be developing for another 1,000 years, or at least 600 or 700 years.
8590, okay.
Yeah, but like 590, maybe by 1100 or 1200, it looks much more like it looks like today than it looked like in AD 590. But you're already seeing the so-called handwriting on the wall here. You see the primacy of the the man who's in Rome, you see the authority he wields, you see all the churches recognizing him and looking to him to be their leader. And so that then will allow all sorts of things, good and bad, to start happening that wasn't necessarily happening up until then.
So
Yes.
initially, this is my last one, so initially their foundation was Christ,
Yes?
but over time,
Mm-hmm.
other things started to develop doctrinally,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And, okay, so.
Some of the doctrine in response to what they considered heresy, others just to fill in the gaps from what they felt like was not clear in the New Testament itself. Remember, we spoke on Monday how that they were starting to look not at just what does it say in the apostolic traditions, which is what they call the scriptures, but they were also looking at what did the bishop interpret that to mean. And that's where what was mentioned earlier with modern Catholics, they look to the bishop to tell them what it means.
And leadership began to develop.
And then the third thing was not just what did the bishop think it meant, but what did the bishop decide was the best thing to do right now.
What did he decide?
It's just his decision. So the church was sort of being built on this three-legged stool with these three supports underneath it, and it still stands on those today. By that we mean the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Yes, sir.
So prior to 590, before the Pope that oversaw
Mhm.
the entire church, they had, so it's safe to say that the archbishops were prior to 590, and then prior to archbishops were regular bishops, and they just constantly needed someone to oversee each.
Yeah, they just kept building structure.
prior to
And in the 400s, all five churches were still, especially the four in the east, were sort of equal with each other in their influence. And then in the west was Rome, but gradually in the east even, Constantinople, because now the government was located there, and the support of the government is naturally going to go to the church that's right there in town, or the bishop who's right there in town, because he has the ear of the emperor and so forth. And so eventually Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch, their influence just wanes away. It doesn't go away entirely, but it just shrinks down. And so by, say, 500, you really just have two men sort of competing in influence, the Bishop of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, the one in the east and the one in the west. And that competition, even when the Pope finally declares in 590 that he is the father of all the church, the Pope of all the church, the church in the east, the Bishop of Constantinople, didn't agree to that. He acquiesced to that, if you understand the difference.
Give me that, find that word.
Acquiesce, that means he was willing to take a step back and let that be. But that's not the same as saying he agreed with it
Gotcha.
or liked it either.
Compromise?
Yeah, it was a compromise.
Gotcha, okay.
And so for the next 400 years, there'll still be this competition between East and West. But once that vital step was taken of letting the one in Rome be number one, for whatever reason, he's never going to surrender that. And that will eventually be one of the several reasons why the Great Schism of 1054 takes place, when the bishop of the East in Constantinople, the patriarch, wants equal standing again with the father in the West, the bishop or the Pope in the West. He wants to be considered as equal. And that's not going to happen after 400 years of doing it a different way and letting one side have their way all the time.